Section 3, African Society and Culture. Life in Medieval Africa. Around 3000 BC, fishing groups along the Benue River in present-day eastern Nigeria packed belongings in their canoes and moved south and west. The wanderers called themselves Bantu, meaning the people. The Bantu traveled slowly and by different routes. At least some paddled up the Congo River, a waterway twisting 2,700 miles through the rainforests. Many settled, for a time, in the grasslands of Central Africa. From there, they fanned out over much of the land south of the Sahara. By AD 400, Bantu peoples had settled much of Africa. Historians are not sure why Bantu left their homeland. Perhaps the land became too crowded. Maybe farmers wore out the soil. Or the Bantu may have just drifted, the way pioneers sometimes do. Wherever they went, the Bantu took their culture with them. They spread skills such as pottery making, mining, and ironworking. They also spread their language. Today, more than 120 million Africans speak hundreds of Bantu languages, including Swahili. The Bantu migrations, or movements of large number of people, are the reason people all across Africa share some common ideas and traditions. The Bantu, for example, believed in one supreme creator and a spirit world where ancestors live. As you read in the last section, this was a common belief in many peoples in many places in Africa. Importance of family. The family formed the basis of African society. People often lived in extended families or families made up of several generations. They included anywhere from 10 to hundreds of members. Many villages, especially Bantu villages, were matrilineal. They traced their descent through mothers rather than fathers. When a woman married, however, she joined her husband's family. To make up for the loss, her family received gifts, cloth, metal tools, cattle, or goats from the husband's family. All families valued children greatly. They saw them as a link between the past and the future. Some people, like the Yoruba of what is today Nigeria, believed an ancestor might be reborn as a child. They also knew children guaranteed that the family would live on. In praising the family, one Yoruba poet wrote, "When a group of boys, girls, men, or wives go together in a happy company, dignity attends them in every step." Education and community. In Africa's villages, education was carried out by the family and other villagers. Children learned the history of their people and skills needed as adults. In West Africa, griots, or storytellers, helped in schooling. They kept alive an oral history, the stories passed down from generation to generation. Many stories included a lesson about living. Lessons also were given through short proverbs. One Bantu proverb stated, "A good deed will make a good neighbor." Grandparents and other older people also kept oral histories alive. Role of women. As in most medieval societies, women in Africa acted mostly as wives and mothers. Men had more rights and controlled much of what women did. Visitors to Africa, however, saw exceptions. European explorers were amazed to learn that women served as soldiers in some African kingdoms. African women also won fame as rulers. In the AD 600s, Queen Dihia al-Kahina led the fight against the Muslim invasion of her kingdom, which was located about where Mauritania is today. Another woman ruler was Queen Anazinga, who ruled lands in what are now Angola and Congo. She spent almost 40 years battling Portuguese slave traders. Slavery. In 1441, a Portuguese sea captain sailed down Africa's western coast. His goal was to bring the first African captives back to Portugal. During the voyage, the captain and his 9 sailors seized 12 Africans, men, women, and boys. The ship then sailed back to Portugal. These captives represented only a small portion of a slave trade that would grow into the millions. Slavery within Africa. Europeans did not invent slavery. For a long time it had existed throughout the world. In Africa, Bantu chiefs raided nearby villages for captives. These captives became laborers or were freed for a payment. Africans also enslaved criminals or enemies taken in war. These enslaved Africans became part of the Saharan trade. However, as long as Africans stayed in Africa, hope of escape still existed. Enslaved Africans might also win their freedom through hard work or by marrying a free person. The trade in humans also grew as the trade with Muslim merchants increased. The Quran forbade enslavement of Muslims. Muslims, however, could enslave non-Muslims. Arab traders therefore began to trade horses, cotton, and other goods for enslaved non-Muslim Africans. When Europeans arrived in West Africa, a new market for enslaved Africans opened. Africans armed with European guns began raiding villages to seize captives to sell. The European slave trade. In 1444, a Portuguese ship docked at a port in Portugal. Sailors unloaded the cargo, 235 enslaved Africans. Tears ran down the faces of some. Others cried for help. A Portuguese official described the scene. But to increase their sufferings still more, was it needful to part fathers from sons, husbands from wives, brothers from brothers. Barely 3 years had passed since the arrival of the first African captains of Portugal. Some merchants who had hoped to sell gold brought from Africa now sold humans instead. At first, most enslaved Africans stayed in Portugal, working as laborers. This changed when the Portuguese settled the Atlantic islands of Madeira, Azores, and the Cape Verde. There, climate was perfect for growing cotton, grapes, and sugarcane on plantations or huge farms. Harvesting sugarcane was hard labor. Planters could not pay high wages to get workers, so they used enslaved Africans instead. Many Africans had farming skills and the ability to make tools. Enslaved people were not paid and could be fed and kept cheaply. By 1500, Portugal was the world's leading supplier of sugar. The rest of Europe followed Portugal's example. In the late 1400s, Europeans arrived in the Americas. They set up sugar plantations and brought enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to work the fields. They also used enslaved people to grow tobacco, rice, and cotton. African culture. We are almost a nation of dancers, musicians, and poets, declared Oduwa Aquina in describing the Igbo people of West Africa. He might have had added artists, weavers, woodcarvers, and metalworkers too. African peoples like the Igbo excelled in many art forms. When slave traders seized Africans like the Aquino from their homelands, they also uprooted their cultures. Africans carried these cultures with them in what has become known as the African diaspora, the spreading of African people and culture around the world. People of African descent held on to memories of their cultures and passed them down from generation to generation. The heritage of Africa can be seen and heard in the United States today, not just in the faces and voices of African descendants, but their gifts to our culture. African art. Cave paintings are the earliest form of African art we know about. They show people hunting animals, dancing, and doing everyday chores. As in other parts of the world, African art and religion developed hand in hand. Early African cave paintings, as well as later art, almost always had some religious meaning or use. Woodcarvers made masks and statues, for example, to celebrate African religious beliefs. Each carved piece of wood captured some part of the spiritual world. African works of art also told stories and served practical purposes. Artists working in wood, ivory, or bronze show the faces of important leaders, everyday people, and later European explorers and traders. Weavers designed cloth similar to cloth still worn today. You may have seen the brightly colored kente cloth of West Africa. Many people wear it today. Music and dance. Music played a part in almost all aspects of African life. People used it to express their religious feelings or to get through an everyday task like planting a field. In many African songs, the singer calls out a line, then the other singers repeat it back. Musical instruments such as drums, whistles, horns, flutes, or banjos were used to keep the beat. Africans believed dance allowed the spirits to express themselves, so they used it to celebrate important events such as birth and death. Nearly everybody danced. Lines of women and men swayed and clapped their hands. Individual dancers leaped and twirled. In the background, drummers sounded out the rhythm. Enslaved Africans sometimes relied on the music to remind them of their homeland. Songs of hardship eventually developed into types of music that we know today as the blues. Songs of religious faith and hopes for freedom grew into spirituals or gospel songs. Over time, other forms of African-based music developed, such as ragtime jazz, rock and roll, and more recently rap. Storytelling. Africans also kept alive their storytelling tradition. A few enslaved Africans escaped and were able to record their stories. Others retold their stories aloud. Those who heard the stories repeated them. They also retold tales taught by griots in the African homeland. Popular stories often told how small animals such as turtles and rabbits outsmarted larger ones. In more recent times, some African Americans have renewed ties with their past by taking African names or giving them to their children. This also helps keep alive African history and culture.